I was sitting in a coffee shop the other day when a friend slid his phone across the table, his eyes wide with that, "Can you believe this? Look." It was a headline. Something, outlandish about a hidden political scandal involving a computer left in a repair shop. He didn't have a source, and he didn't have any proof, but he had something much, much more powerful. He had a feeling. "It just makes sense, doesn't it?" he whispered, already halfway into a rabbit hole of theories. So I tried the logical approach. I told him, that's actually been debunked. I expected him to pause, maybe even thank me for the clarity. Instead, he just looked at me with this mix of pity and frustration, as if I were the one who had been fooled. He didn't need data or a rigorous argument. He had a narrative that felt right, and that narrative was now locked in like a deadbolt. It was a chilling moment, watching a lie take root in real time. But what's even more unsettling is the raw math behind that interaction. According to recent psychological research, if someone tries to misinform you about a new topic, there is a staggering 99.6% chance they will succeed. It's a near-perfect success rate. Once that misinformation enters the mind, it doesn't just sit there. It takes hold and sticks like tar. We like to think of the truth as this powerful antidote, a simple light that dispels the darkness. But the reality is so much more lopsided. While a lie is nearly 100% effective at taking root, correcting that lie is a delicate uphill battle with a much lower success rate. It's the psychological gap that leaves most of us vulnerable every time we open an app or check the news. So why is the human brain such a willing host for fiction? Why does a simple correction so often fail to move the needle? And if the odds of a lie sticking are 266 to 1, is it even possible to win the war for the truth?
That opening story just perfectly sets up the mission for this deep dive, doesn't it? It highlights this vast psychological gap we're all dealing with, the difference between how easily a lie is accepted and how incredibly difficult it is to remove it. And we have a fascinating stack of sources here today, weaving together threads from, rigorous empirical psychology studies that actually quantify misinformation, all the way to political philosophy, examining the collapse of common sense. And even comparative legal analysis of this institutional response that's being called the therapeutic state. Our mission today is to move beyond just reciting facts. We need to unpack this profound human vulnerability. Why does fiction take root so easily? What happens when institutional trust just collapses? And how does this not only affect our public reality, but critically, our closest personal relationships? We're trying to understand the fundamental blueprint of shared reality itself when the very foundation of facts starts to crumble.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with the cold, hard data. That absolutely shocking 99.6% figure. It sounds almost cartoonishly successful for a lie, yet this comes from a robust quantitative analysis. Where exactly does this number come from, and why is it so definitive?
Right. So we're pulling this directly from a really significant 2017 meta-analysis. It was published in Psychological Science. And a meta-analysis, as you know, doesn't just run one experiment. It aggregates data across a huge number of existing high-quality studies on how people process new information and then, subsequent corrections. The researchers found the effect so strong, it genuinely shocked them. When you present misinformation on a new issue, something the participant has absolutely no prior knowledge about, the odds of that person accepting and believing that lie are 266 to 1.
Wow.
That is the statistical origin of the 99.6% success rate for initial attempts to misinform.
266 to 1. That is just staggering. It sounds less like a failure of education and more like, a fundamental efficient design feature of the human mind. Why is the act of misinforming someone on a blank slate almost guaranteed to succeed? What cognitive mechanism is so easily exploited here?
It really speaks to the efficiency of what psychologists call system one thinking. That's the fast, intuitive, automatic part of the brain. When we encounter new information, our primary psychological function is to integrate it and quickly create a coherent worldview. The brain is geared toward filling voids. So if no competing information exists, a piece of information that's presented as fact, it just fills that cognitive space, and the brain locks it in as a provisional truth almost instantly.
Right, it's just looking for something to put in that empty file folder.
Exactly. It's only later, when we activate the slower, more energy-intensive system 2, the rational, critical evaluation part, that we start applying rigorous testing of veracity. But by then, the lie has already claimed the territory.
So the lie is quick and effortless. The truth is slow and requires significant energy. Okay, that clarifies why the researchers cited this as one of the strongest effects that had ever estimated in their career. Now, let's get to the flip side of that equation. How effective is the truth at pulling out that tar-like lie once it's stuck?
Well, the correction rate on its own, is actually quite respectable. Corrections are successful 86% of the time, so the odds of correcting properly are 6 to 1. If we were discussing, say, a manufacturing defect, an 86% fix rate would be a huge win.
A huge win. But you're arguing that the near 100% initial success rate of the lie just renders that 86% correction rate insufficient. It can't close the psychological gap.
That's it, exactly. The lie is 99.6% effective at initial penetration. Even if you manage to correct 8 or 9 out of 10 lies, you are still left with that fractional percentage where the initial false narrative just persists. It hangs on. The lie sticks like tar, and removing it requires far more cognitive effort than putting it there in the first place. This lopsided psychological math explains why, on a mass scale, misinformation is winning. Its initial advantage is just too high for even highly effective correction efforts to fully overcome. It's a constant, unequal battle of attrition.
And this must be why it is so critical to distinguish between all misinformation and the kind that actually matters most in the public square, what you call actionable misinformation. What do we mean by that term?
Actionable misinformation is the kind that has immediate and often destructive behavioral implications. It's misinformation designed for an operational effect. It seeks to compel a specific, immediate action or inaction. A perfect example that the source cited involves political suppression. If you see an online ad that falsely tells you, click here to vote online, when that is not a legal voting mechanism in your area, that is actionable.
Right, it actively disrupts civic action. It's not just a character smear. It's an attempt to weaponize the lie for an immediate operational effect, to change behavior in a material way.
Precisely. And another powerful example is targeting specific ideological vulnerabilities within the population. The source mentioned that claiming a candidate is a socialist could be highly persuasive to groups like, for example, Cuban Americans or Venezuelans.
Yes, of course, because for those groups, due to their profound historical context with communist or socialist regimes, and sometimes generational trauma associated with them, that single word triggers an immediate, visceral, and actionable response.
That is the power of targeting. The lie instantly exploits a pre-existing ideological framework. It short-circuits their rational evaluation of the candidate's actual policies. It translates directly into bias or a shift in voting intention. It's misinformation that relies on historical memory and perceived threat to achieve maximum stickiness.
So we know the lie sticks easily, and the correction is this huge uphill climb. We've established that simply stating that was false doesn't cut it. My friend in the coffee shop proved that when he just brushed my correction aside. How do the experts advise we effectively fight back? Let's go through the 4 steps for effective debunking that were summarized by those 22 authors led by Steve Lewandowski.
Okay. The key, and this is crucial, is that the correction must be robust and explanatory. So first, you must briefly and clearly describe the misinformation being corrected.
So you have to bring it up again.
You have to. You need to reactivate the false memory in the mind of the audience so the correction has a target to dislodge. You can't just hope they remember what you're talking about.
That prevents the lie from remaining a provisional truth in some dark corner of the mind. Okay, what's step 2?
Step 2 is presenting the correction clearly. Sometimes using graphics or simple charts, whatever, helps the accurate information stick and build its own narrative structure. But step 3 is the most important one, because it directly addresses the mechanism of the lie.
Which is explaining why the initial misinformation was wrong, providing a complete explanation.
This is the critical step. You have to provide a complete, robust, and explanatory alternative narrative. You can't just say, no, the emails were fabricated. You have to explain how they were fabricated, who fabricated them, and what the motive was. You need to provide a coherent, competing narrative that not only contradicts the original, but displaces it entirely. It's like filling a hole in the road. You don't just put a sign next to it. You have to fill it with new, solid pavement.
So telling a better, more logical story using the truth, rather than just issuing a retraction. And the 4th step, this addresses the profound problem of cynicism we'll get into later, using trustworthy sources.
Yes. And this step highlights the crisis of credibility we're all living through. The research noted that trustworthiness matters even more than pure expertise. Expertise is, an objective qualification, a PhD, a certain title. Trustworthiness is a subjective, relational quality.
So if the audience views an expert, however qualified, as personally untrustworthy or politically biased, their facts will just be rejected outright. It shows the war isn't just about facts, it's a foundational battle for authority and credibility itself.
That's absolutely right. And this moves us into the crucial role of the audience, who cannot afford to be passive. The individual listener or reader has a job to do here, which the sources call epistemic vigilance.
Epistemic vigilance. In plain terms, this just means working harder than the algorithm, right?
Right.
Actively resisting that initial effortless acceptance of the lie.
It is the requirement for active critical thinking. The research suggests that the more people produce their own counterarguments proactively, before, during, and after a correction, the better the results will be. You have to encourage the audience to counter-argue. This is the difference between consuming a story passively and actively engaging with the material, questioning the source and the claims.
For the layperson, then, the general advice seems to boil down to behavioral changes, almost like changing a diet. We need to stop treating certain social media platforms as news sources.
The analogy offered by the sources is blunt. Facebook and YouTube are the McDonald's of the media diet. They're easy, fast, highly engaging, but they should not be your primary source of informational sustenance. The advice is simple. If you see a provocative headline on social media, do not rely on the algorithm feed to define reality for you. Go directly to a reputable newspaper source, search for the full story, and verify the facts yourself. Take control of your information intake.
But hold on, isn't calling social media McDonald's a bit overly simplistic? Don't these platforms also provide community? And aren't they sometimes the only place where whistleblowers can start conversations that formal media might ignore?
That's a fair challenge, and yes, they do provide a community and a necessary function for disseminating information very quickly. But the distinction the experts are making is about primary sourcing. When the algorithm is designed for engagement rather than truth, it actively rewards emotionally resonant falsehoods. So the critique is about dependency. Relying on them for your daily informational diet is dangerous because they operate without the epistemic rigor of established, editorially responsible newsrooms. The moment we stop trusting and relying on those formal sources, we become isolated.
And that isolation is the source trust issue we keep circling back to. If the media are frequently downgraded as fake news, then rejecting social media just creates a vacuum where that 99.6% successful misinformation can filter in.
That's the critical insight leading to part 2. If you are isolated from any formal source of regularly infused, fact-checked information, you become persuadable to narratives that may be completely untrue, simply because they're socially shared or, more importantly, because they provide a coherent, satisfying explanation for your confusion and frustration. This collapse of source trust is the fertile ground for deeper ideological shifts.
And part 2 is where we shift from the cold, hard data of the lie to the warm, emotional human need that the lie fulfills. It's the architecture of betrayal.
What's fascinating here is how the breakdown of institutional reliability creates this profound psychological void. The sources introduce an anecdote of a man named Elias. Elias lived in a decaying industrial town. For 40 years, he trusted the local newspaper, the town council, the local institutions. He was a pillar of his community. But after the main factory closed and massive local scandals eroded his faith in every expert, that trust didn't just fade away, it curdled.
That's the core psychological mechanism we need to understand, the noble sense of betrayal.
Exactly. For Elias, believing a conspiracy theory, for instance, the idea that the local water supply is secretly being used for mass behavioral control, is not an error in logic, it's an act of dignity. It is a form of resistance against a system that he feels has fundamentally abandoned him.
So if he was betrayed, how does believing an absurdity become an act of dignity for him?
It becomes a noble refusal to be fooled again. If the official reality, the institutional narrative, has repeatedly proven to be a lie, then believing a counter-narrative, no matter how outlandish it seems, feels like taking back intellectual control. It's a statement that says, I know the real nature of the deceit and I refuse to cooperate. This is the tragic outcome when elite institutional standards collapse, leaving these atomized individuals grasping for any truth that feels like it's finally on their side.
This connects beautifully to the classic political philosophy of Hannah Arendt, whose work warns about this precise precondition for the acceptance of absurdity.
Arendt's analysis of the loss of common sense, particularly in the rise of totalitarianism, is so crucial here. She warned that totalitarian propaganda can outrageously insult common sense only in places where common sense has already lost its validity. This suggests the loss of our shared factual reality actually precedes the acceptance of absurdities like QAnon or similar extreme mythologies.
Her diagnosis suggests this desire for absurd, unifying theories stems from a profound human necessity, a hunger for a consistent explanation.
Yes. People crave a narrative to make sense of the sheer fortuitousness that pervades reality. They struggle with the untidiness of events, sudden, undeserved injustices, economic crashes, or just incomprehensible mass carnage. Ideology, or a conspiracy theory, steps in to connect these random dots into a law-like, predictable pattern. It offers a comforting sense of supersense where everything happens for a consistent, hyper-logical, albeit often malevolent, reason.
It's important here to clearly distinguish between Arndt's view of ideology and conspiracy theories, because they are related, but they serve different functions within this structure of control.
Absolutely. Arndt viewed ideology like Nazism or classical Bolshevism as the global, high-level worldview. It explains events as surface manifestations of larger, impersonal, law-governed, or inexorable forces. Things like inevitable class conflict or biological struggle among races. These ideologies often pretend to be scientific or hyperlogical, achieving that supersense by making all reality seem predetermined.
So ideology is the grand, quasi-scientific framework. Where do the specific, juicy, narrative-driven stories, the conspiracy theories, fit into this rigid framework?
Conspiracy theories, by contrast, substitute these cold, impersonal, law-governed forces with human-like evil cabals executing secret plots. The 300 families, the deep state, you name it. They are fundamentally anti-science in many ways, substituting careful analysis with dramatic narratives. Yet, paradoxically, a totalitarian scientific ideology needs them. They function as essential auxiliary hypotheses to save the core ideology from contradictory evidence.
So if the planned factory output falls short, or if the political movement fails to achieve a quick victory, the ideologue doesn't admit the theory is flawed. They blame the specific secret plot of saboteurs and foreign intelligence services.
Precisely. The conspiracy theory is the user-friendly, dramatized, and easily digestible version of the esoteric high ideology, making it consumable for the masses while protecting the theoretical framework from facts.
And that dynamic is what explains the strange mental state Arndt noted in the totalitarian mindset. A mixture of profound gullibility and intense cynicism. How does she resolve that seeming contradiction? You have gullibility, willingness to believe the worst absurdity and cynicism, holding every public statement to be a lie anyhow.
Arndt recognized that this is not a logical contradiction. It becomes a destructive epistemic vice. The individual is no longer concerned with objective, factual truth. They are willing to settle for true enough because the goal of the propaganda is not accurate perception, but organization. The individual is being recruited to a tribe where belief and factual verification no longer matter, only the binary reality of us versus them.
Facts are secondary to tribal identity and loyalty.
And the cynicism, the premise that every public statement by opposing sources is automatically a lie, actually excuses the individual's own gullibility. It turns it into what you might call culpable credulousness. They can rationalize, since I know the system is rigged and the media is lying, this wild story, which validates my worldview, is true enough for my side, and that's all that matters. This self-reinforcing circular logic is what fundamentally defeats objective truth in the public square.
This loss of factual common sense is often a symptom of something deeper happening at the sociological level, which leads us to the story of Sarah.
This is a really important transition because it grounds this philosophical concept in modern life. The sources highlight the experience of Sarah, a young woman who grew up in a hypermodern environment where the traditional filters for common sense, the core family, and established religious frameworks had dissolved. She was left without the usual anchors that ground individuals in a shared reality.
And the sociological analysis here is that this dissolution, this atomization, creates a massive vulnerability.
It does. Radical ideologies and conspiracies rush to fill that profound void. Misinformation stops being merely a flawed news source and starts providing a substitute for belonging and a sense of shared reality. It operates almost like a clinical pathology. The loss of tradition has left a hole that radical ideologies are eager to fill by offering that consistent explanation and group identity that was once provided by family or church.
It's the ultimate tragic trade-off. The quest for radical freedom and individualism inadvertently creates a vulnerability that is immediately exploited by radical, often totalitarian, group structures promising absolute certainty. That sociological collapse takes us perfectly into part 3, where we look at the very personal relational costs of these beliefs and the institutional responses that may be contributing to the problem.
And the costs are immediate and tangible. They extend beyond the political sphere right into the living room. We have empirical research now supporting the overwhelming anecdotal evidence, like the reports on Reddit's RQAnon casualties, detailing how conspiracy beliefs severely strain close relationships.
Well, what are the specific relational costs identified in these studies? What actually happens to families?
The findings are pretty consistent across the board. Participants reported less closeness in their relationships with conspiracy believers, significantly lower overall relationship satisfaction, and a decreased frequency and quality of their interactions. Furthermore, the closer the relationship, say a spouse, a child, or a parent, the more likely the participant was to experience a specific painful paradox. They were both more likely to tolerate the belief out of love and more likely to confront the believer out of necessity.
That makes perfect emotional sense. If it's a stranger, you avoid them and move on. If it's your own family, you tolerate the underlying bond, but you are also compelled to confront the destructive narrative because you can't afford to lose the person entirely to the ideology.
The research also drew a sharp line between harmful and harmless beliefs. Believing in a harmless historical oddity might be eccentric but manageable, but harmful conspiracy theories, like those influencing health decisions or civic participation, things like masks are ineffective or vaccines are harmful, led to significantly less tolerance, a greater willingness to confront, and measurably lower relationship satisfaction.
Why do these beliefs cause such relationship strain? What are the underlying mechanisms the research identifies beyond just simple disagreement?
There are two main mechanisms. The first is attitude distance. Conspiracy beliefs often involve political or ideological extremes. When someone adopts these, their worldview rapidly diverges from those in their social network. The greater the attitude dissimilarity, the less interpersonal liking there is. It suggests that a stable, shared reality is a fundamental requirement for functional, stable relationships.
And the second mechanism relates back to the contempt for common sense we discussed with Ardlancet stigma.
Right. People view conspiracy theories as flawed narratives believed by those on the fringes of society. Therefore, the non-believer becomes reluctant to maintain existing social interactions to avoid stigma by association. If you are seen publicly associating with someone deeply entrenched in fringe beliefs, others may question your own judgment or even your mental stability. The fear of that association is a powerful driver of disengagement.
So, the loss of shared reality isolates the believer and forces their loved ones to retreat for their own social protection. Now, let's pivot and look at how modern institutional systems, seemingly designed to help and restore faith, may actually be contributing to this problem by dissolving the very foundation of logic and responsibility itself. This is where we introduce the concept of the therapeutic state.
Thomas Sez's argument about the therapeutic state is profoundly provocative. Historically, society categorized problems like idleness, vagrancy, and lawlessness as crimes or sins. They required discipline or punishment, and that was all predicated on the idea of adult moral agency.
But the therapeutic state medicalizes these behaviors, treating them as illnesses instead.
Precisely. The core argument is that behaviors like idleness and lawlessness are not caused by a disease like schizophrenia. Rather, schizophrenia is the name of the fictitious disease attributed to persons exhibiting those behaviors. The diagnosis functions to establish by medico-legal fiat that certain disorderly persons are sick, which excuses their behavior as no fault.
So it's a social and moral function, not a medical one. It lets society avoid the uncomfortable moral questions of accountability and responsibility for behaviors deemed undesirable.
Yes, the medicalization provides a convenient no-fault neurobiological disorder excuse, as one person's sister described her violent schizophrenic relative in the source material. This mechanism is strategically achieved through the analogy between children and the insane.
That strategic analogy is crucial. Why is equating an adult exhibiting lawlessness with a child needing care so strategically destructive to moral agency?
Because children are governed by care and paternalism, they lack full moral agency. Adults are governed by discipline and punishment. By applying the language of paternalism and care, the therapeutic lens, to protesting or disorderly adults, the state can justify treating them not as citizens, but as patients requiring treatment or control. This obscures the fundamental distinctions between the rules appropriate for each group.
The consequence, then, is the destruction of our fundamental ideas about personal responsibility. If idleness is redefined as an illness, the person is excused from responsibility, but society then gains the authority to treat them, often involuntarily.
It creates a biased moral ledger. If negative outcomes, like idleness or poor impulse control, are excused as illness, but positive outcomes, like productivity and success, are credited to free will, we commit ourselves to a system of self-justification that undermines accountability. Saz argues this destruction of moral agency ultimately increases the state's power in the name of benevolence.
And this philosophical shift bleeds directly into our professional lives and the structures of meritocracy, which brings us to the story of Marcus, the data scientist.
Marcus's experience exemplifies the fight against therapeutic culture, acting as a radical ideological solvent in the workplace. He noticed that prioritizing feelings, the therapeutic focus on emotional sensitivity, began to overshadow objective data and results. Colleagues were hesitant to correct factual falsehoods or poor data practices if the correction felt unkind or insensitive to the person who produced the error.
That completely dissolves the concept of meritocracy itself.
Yeah.
If we can't agree on factual truth, we can't reward factual achievement.
And the argument Marcus made is that logic and objective data must be the ultimate defense to restore the hard floor of objective reality. Correcting falsehoods requires a strictly logic-based approach to defend meritocracy and free speech against these deconstructive solvents. This modern phenomenon aligns perfectly with Christopher Lasch's work, which described how the rise of the therapeutic age erases the connections between individuals and society, resulting in a minimal self obsessed with external perception and validation rather than internal character or objective truth.
So, the therapeutic impulse, which was meant to free us and validate our feelings, ironically makes us more vulnerable to groupthink and undermines the very structure of shared objective reality. Now let's widen the scope in part 4 and look at how this collapse of common sense is weaponized on a geopolitical scale.
This is where we revisit Arndt's point. The goal of totalitarian propaganda is not persuasion, but organization. It recruits people into a tribe where only tribal identity matters, and the political ideology uses conspiracy theories as these auxiliary hypotheses to maintain consistency and explain away failures.
A contemporary example of this organized ideological fiction is the concept of Russism, or Rashism, a neologism that's emerged from the conflict in Ukraine.
Yes, Russism is defined as a unique 21st century Russian state ideology, featuring authoritarianism, extreme nationalism, and aggressive imperialism. It fundamentally relies on the notion of irredentism, a desire to restore Russia to a perceived former glory, often referencing the vast territory of the Soviet Union. This is why the systematic erasure of Ukrainian culture in occupied territories, such as replacing historical memorials with Russian monuments, is viewed by critics as a classic example of imperial symbolism used to enforce the required narrative.
And the really interesting observation here is the idea of schizofascism, raised by historian Timothy Snyder.
Snyder noted this profound historical paradox. Modern regimes define themselves as anti-fascist, constantly projecting the label fascist onto their adversaries, while simultaneously embodying core fascist tenets. This allows fascism a kind of backdoor to return, resulting in a schizofascism, fascism disguised as a struggle against fascism. The key is to create such a profound cult of unreason that the populace can no longer distinguish between the accuser and the accused.
Sociologist Grigor Yudin pointed out how this regime functions internally, particularly the use of the false image of general popular support to enforce compliance.
Yudin argued that the regime uses this false image to threaten both the elites and the atomized individuals. The elites fear that the people will support repression against them, and the atomized individual, already vulnerable from the collapse of traditional structures, fears confronting the non-existent people masses alone if they express disagreement. This just highlights how societal atomization is deliberately exploited to enforce political conformity.
If the conflict for truth is waged on a logical battlefield, we need technological defenses that can restore clarity and logic. Let's look at the modern efforts to combat misinformation, referencing the Teller dual system framework for fake news detection.
The Teller framework is a brilliant technological response because it directly mirrors the dual system theory of human cognition. It posits two AI systems working in tandem. System 1 is intuitive and fast analogous to deep learning. System 2 is logical and rational analogous to symbolic learning.
How is the Teller framework structured to achieve this transparent, logic-based defense?
Well, it splits the detection process into the cognition system and the decision system. The cognition system transforms human expertise, like the guidelines used by fact-checkers, into a set of yes-no question templates called logic predicates. It uses large language models, the intuitive side, to answer these questions and generate truth values for those logic atoms.
And the decision system then synthesizes those truth values into a final verdict.
Yes. The decision system uses a differentiable neural symbolic model. And crucially, it integrates the truth values from the cognition system to deduce the final authenticity using human-readable logic rules that it learns automatically from the data.
What's the immense value of this transparency and logic-based system over standard black box AI models?
The transparency gives you explainability, generalizability, and controllability, which is what we lose in that cynical gullibility cycle. We can actually see the rules the system learns. For example, P2, P3, and P8 check consistency across multiple source articles, whereas P6 scrutinizes improper intention or highly emotional language. This visible, logic-based ensemble mitigates the risks of opaque large language models, things like hallucinations, by making the reasoning process visible and allowing human intervention. It restores the hard floor of objective reasoning into the fight against misinformation.
The restoration of that hard floor connects back to the broader philosophical struggle to preserve liberty and moral agency in the face of the therapeutic state. We need to look at James L. Nolan Jr.'s comparison of problem-solving courts across common law countries.
The problem-solving court movement, particularly drug courts and mental health courts, is a key legal expression of therapeutic jurisprudence. They aim to be therapeutic, holistic, and result-oriented, and they blur the traditional lines of due process in pursuit of what they see as better social outcomes for the defendants.
And the comparison between the U.S. and other common law countries reveals a fundamental difference in judicial philosophy, which Marianne Glendon categorized as the romantic versus the classical judge.
Right. American judges tend toward the romantic, bold, result-oriented, and often non-traditional. They are the ones allowing hugging, practicing cartwheels in the courtroom upon a client's success, or meeting with clients in chambers judges who color outside the lines, as one put it. They see themselves as activists and community leaders, actively seeking funding and engaging in community matters outside the four walls of the courtroom.
And that stands in stark contrast to countries like Scotland, Australia, and England, which demonstrate greater structural, interpretive, and personal restraint, the traits of the classical judge.
Structural restraint is evident in their deference to the legislature. Australian drug courts, for instance, are strictly legislatively based, with the Drug Court Act specifying eligibility, rewards, and sanctions in great detail. Judges there feel this legislative foundation provides essential safeguards that don't rely solely on the personality or goodwill of the individual judge. Interpretive restraint involves strict adherence to constitutional precepts and statutory law.
And the third type of restraint, personal restraint, seems to be a deeply embedded cultural accent where judges intentionally hold themselves in check.
This personal restraint is crucial. Judges in non-U.S. countries are highly vigilant about the potential for blurring boundaries inherent in the problem-solving court format. They fear that therapeutic considerations could override long-standing freedoms and rights. For example, a Melbourne magistrate worried about pre-court team meetings where the defendant is absent, violating the principle of open justice, which demands transparency in the justice process.
And many foreign judges resist the high informality, the clapping, the overly personal engagement, seeing it as unbecoming or worse, patronizing. They believe a more formal court appropriately signifies the solemnity and seriousness of what is occurring.
The core of the foreign resistance is that legitimacy rests on protecting due process, neutrality, and impartiality procedural fairness, not on therapeutic promises of personal fulfillment. The fear is that if law becomes merely good feeling, individual fulfillment, and therapeutic healing, it risks fostering dependence in the name of self-reliance, ironically increasing state power.
So the debate boils down to two competing visions of legitimacy. The first argues that therapeutic innovations will restore public confidence. The second, exemplified by Australia and Scotland, argues that protecting due process rights, open justice, and traditional formality is what sustains legitimacy.
The second vision insists that the symbols of justice, particularly Lady Justice's blindfold, represent an active principle of restraint. It is an act of judicial self-restraint, maintaining the judge as impartial and neutral, standing metaphorically elevated beyond the contentiousness of everyday life. To remove that blindfold, to become actively engaged with the personal lives of the defendants in pre-court meetings, risks undermining the neutrality that is essential for long-term public confidence.
It seems the ultimate lesson woven through all these sources, from the 99.6% success rate of a lie to the judge's self-restraint, is that if you lose the hard floor of logic and objective reality, whether in politics, relationships, or law, you lose the ability to defend the foundations of individual liberty and justice itself.
Absolutely. We started with that terrifying data point of the 99.6% success rate of the lie, which exploits the deepest human desire for a simple, coherent, consistent narrative in an untidy, complex reality. This vulnerability is then deepened when structural trust in institutions collapses, allowing cynicism and gullibility to coexist in a powerful, tribalistic dynamic.
Whether we are fighting global political systems that rely on schizofascism to justify aggression, or simply trying to navigate a relationship strained by a conspiracy theory, or even defending the core principles of due process against well-intentioned therapeutic erosion, the war is less about inserting new facts and more about constantly repairing the foundations of shared reality, logic, and institutional confidence. The struggle to maintain liberty and truth requires relentless vigilance against the allure of simple unifying fictions. That visible, verifiable logic is, in the end, our only reliable defense.